All right, so after a long period of technical difficulties, we are here finally recording the first ever Subversive History Podcast. My name's Pat. This is my co-host, Johnny. What's up, Johnny?
What's up, Pat?
How you feeling?
I'm feeling a little beaten down by technology.
You feeling a little anarcho-primitivist right now?
I'm feeling a little anprim. I feel like, I'm not gonna say who, but he's
a certain person who's no longer with us.
certain person who's
a recently departed spiritual predecessor of
who I politically disagree with on every level.
But his ghost is with us today.
Yeah.
So there's probably a lot of people that are familiar with us from Twitch that are going to be listening to us. We do typically have a Twitch stream where we talk about subversive topics of politics and history and theory and things like that. You can find us on
twitch.tv / subversive history, no caps, no space.
No cap. So this is going to be our first ever podcast. So we've been doing this Twitch content for a while, and what we do on our Twitch stream is we take books, mostly history books of a political nature, and we do chapter by chapter breakdowns of them, and we'll spend 4 to 5 hours talking about a single chapter of a single book that we're talking about, and we understand that's extremely long form, extremely in depth. And there's going to be a lot of people that's not going to be amenable to. You might not want to hear us talk about a book for literally 30 hours.
You may not even have the time to watch.
Exactly.
Because I've not been doing such a great job recently of uploading, our episodes onto YouTube. But I think that, for you audio listeners out there, for everybody, doing their work commute and whatnot, I want to make sure that, you're able to get at this very, edutainment content as well.
Right. So that's kind of what we're trying to do here with the podcast is we're going to take books that we've already gone through on stream in excruciating detail and try to provide a summary / review of the books in a more compact medium, such as a podcast. This thing's probably going to run like an hour to an hour and a half. Some books will probably require multiple parts. But regardless, if you're listening to this, we're glad you're here. We hope you like it. Today, we're going to be talking about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by an author, historian named Illan Pappi. Now, the Israel and Palestine conflict is probably, one of the more important and divisive conflicts of the modern age and the past several decades. It is extremely relevant to many of the conflicts that we've seen throughout the Middle East since the inception of the State of Israel, whether that be with Egypt and Nasser and the Suez Canal issue and the various wars that have gone on throughout the Middle East. Very many of them, have a history with the project of Israel. So that's why we're excited to talk about this. It also just kind of worked out this way because this is the last book that we read. It's the most recent. It wasn't chosen for any specific reason other than it's the most recent one that we read. It's the most fresh one in our mind. So go ahead.
I think we should also tell listeners, watchers, that the other books that we've covered, if you haven't ever watched this, before, we covered The Divide by Jason Hickel, not Jackson Hinkle, right? We've covered Black Shirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. We have covered a little bit or most of 1776, A Counter-Revolution by Gerald Horne.
Most of Killing Hope by William Bloom.
Yeah.
The Sword and the Shield by Peniel Joseph. We're definitely going to be doing one of these for Sword and the Shield, which is about the revolutionary lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
And then also we did March at the Margins by Kevin Anderson, which is probably what the next podcast is going to be on if we just kind of start walking back all the books that we've done on stream. So, I think that's enough introduction. We don't want to drag this thing out too long. If you want to get to know us better, definitely check us out on stream. We'll interact with you. We'll talk to you. And, we definitely get a little bit more loose on stream with our personalities. We're going to try to keep this a little bit more tighter and a little bit, keep it tight to the content. So, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. This book came out in 2006. It is by an Israeli author and historian named Illan Pappi. Now, Illan Pappi is what's called one of the new historians of Israel, which is like in, I believe, the 80s. Israeli historians started to adopt a more critical perspective of the establishment of the state of Israel. And Illan Pappi belongs to this group of revisionist historians that are much more supportive of the Palestinian plight and more critical of the project of Israel. Now, Illan Pappi, I would say, is, out of these new historians, is a little bit more extreme than some of his contemporaries in that movement.
More extreme than Benny Morris.
Benny Morris is probably the most common name that you're going to hear out of those individuals, and Benny and Illan have quite a bit of disagreement on multiple things, which maybe we'll address more as we get through this. But, Illan Pappi, if you go on like his Wikipedia page, you'll see some things about controversies. The controversies are around the Tantura massacre and Teddy Katz's dissertation that he wrote on that. Benny Morris calls him, if not the sloppiest historian in the world, then the most dishonest. So there's definitely heat coming at our boy Pappi. And also, he joined a boycott of the Israeli college that he was a professor at. And eventually that led to him just leaving Israel and going to Britain, where he currently teaches. Outside of for all the criticism, there is much glowing praise for his work. Many Palestinian journals of history exalt the things that he's written. He is cited in many, many academic journals. So for as much criticism as there's also quite a bit of praise for his work also.
So I wanted to bring this up because when you first when we first like kind of discussed the idea, because chat, would ask us like, how come you chose an Israeli historian as opposed to a Palestinian historian? And I think that the answer is actually pretty interesting. That like, as an Israeli historian, right, he could very easily toe the line of, the IDF, right, and suffer literally, no consequences. He could, be enjoying the kind of notoriety, and the kind of ease of movement that like a historian like Benny Morris, right, would have. But,
and not be subjected to like professional exile and death threats.
Yeah, well, that too. I guess you could, scrutiny is kind of like that.
Right. And I mean, also, that's there's obviously that more grand idea of why we chose Illan Pappi, but really what it comes down to is I bought this book a couple years ago and I read it and I liked it, and I thought this was a concise way to talk about the history of the Israeli and Palestine conflict. And that's why we're here. So now that we've kind of identified the author, we've kind of introduced ourselves, there's kind of a disclaimer that I want to put out here in the beginning. Because we're coming out the gates, first Subversive History Podcast, and we're talking about Israel. Now, Israel is a very sensitive topic because I'm very passionate about the issue going on in Palestine, the illegal occupation, the various war crimes that are committed against the Palestinian people, but also I am very much opposed to anti-Semitism. And you know what I mean? Critique of Israel has to come in a very delicate form where we are very careful to say that this is not coming from a place of anti-Semitism. Disagreeing with the Israeli settler colonial project and Zionism is not the same as disagreeing with Judaism as a religion or having some kind of like very disgusting conspiracy theory about Jewish people,
Yes.
which is another reason why I thought it was great. We are reading a Israeli Jewish historian who wrote this book. A number of the books that you're going to find on my shelf are by Israeli Jewish historians, whether it's Illan Pappi, whether it's Norman Finkelstein, whether it's Noam Chomsky, whether it's Avi Shlaim. These are the individuals that I get a lot of my or Palestinian, like Walid Khalidi or Rashid Khalidi. These are individuals that whose books that I read about Israel Palestine. So we are very, very careful to delineate between Zionism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism. You can actually find an intelligence squared debate where the very author of this book, Illan Pappi, defends the position that anti-Zionism does not equate anti-Semitism. So if you're interested in more, check that out. But I've actually gone through in some of these notes that I've taken, and I've removed the word Jewish and inserted the word either Israeli or Zionist, because in some of these notes, whether it's the author writing or like the Wikipedia page or a Palestinian testimony, they may say the word Jewish troops or Jewish people, Jewish immigrants. And, you could obviously take that out of context, and it sounds very, very
especially
bad.
for two people that are not Jewish, right? It's going to be coming from our mouths and being heard in our voices, as opposed to when you are reading this or when you are watching an interview with Illan Pappi, right? These words are coming from, a Jewish historian, a Jewish person, right? And that's how I'm reading books, is I'm reading them in like the voice of the author, right? A lot of times. And, I feel like that's a very wise move. And,
And let's talk about what sets Illan Pappi aside from his contemporaries in the Israeli historian community. So Illan Pappi, unlike Benny Morris and unlike many other more mainstream or conservative Israeli historians, doesn't rely exclusively on IDF archive material,
like
which is proven to be inaccurate, fudged in a way, to make the IDF side of things look more benevolent.
Redacted.
What Illan Pappi relies on is he not only does he speak Hebrew, he also speaks Arabic, and he looks into a lot of Arab testimony, victim testimony, and also the works of Palestinian historians such as Walid Khalidi, who has a very, very important work on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine called All That Remains. So look into Walid Khalidi. He is referenced many, many times throughout this work. So that's why I like Illan Pappi, is because he's not merely just going into the IDF archives. That would be like, imagine if you were looking up history in the United States and you only looked at U.S. records about their time in Vietnam.
Right.
Do you think that the U.S. records of what happened at the My Lai massacre is consistent with what happened, or do you believe that there might be a little bit of fudging the numbers a little bit on that? Get into this, and we're going to try to take this in a linear fashion can you just turn that over? Because it's going to drive me nuts. So we're going to jump into this, and we're going to look at the development of Zionism and the establishment of Israel and the events that happened in 1948 and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and some of its immediate aftermath. So we're going to start with early Zionism. Like, where did this idea of Zionism come from? And I guess to introduce that topic, I'm going to quote directly from the book, the words of Illan Pappi, who states, "Zionism emerged in the late 1880s in Central and Eastern Europe as a national revival movement prompted by the growing pressure on Jews in those regions either to assimilate totally or risk continuing persecution. But the more critical view today sees the Zionist drive to settle in Palestine instead of other possible locations as closely interwoven with 19th century Christian millenarianism and European colonialism." So he kind of puts out both sides of it there, where it's like kind of like probably what the declared mission of Zionism is, where we have growing pressure on Jewish people in Eastern and Central Europe. And then also the more critical view, which says that this is largely a project of European colonialism.
Well, a lot of the colonists, as it were, were coming from Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It says it right there that it's from Central and
Right,
Central and Eastern Europe. So Now, I've also included quite a bit of like information just from mainstream history, mainstream sources of information such as Wikipedia and stuff like that to like add, because like I said, we're dealing with somewhat controversial historian, so like kind of like to add that like it seems like his version of events are not much more extreme than what you could read on Wikipedia or something like that. So we do have a little bit of that in there. We're quoting from the book directly and also just using some kind of like mainstream history sources just to kind of furnish it and make everything go a little bit more smooth. So now we'll talk about who is like the ideological forefather of Zionism, and that is someone named Theodor Herzl. You've heard of this person, right?
Yes.
So he was an Austro-Hungarian Jewish journalist and political activist who was the father of modern political Zionism. Beginning in late 1895, Herzl wrote a book called did you say it? You do the German.
Der Judenstaat.
Which is The State of the Jews in English, which was published February 1896. The book argued that the Jewish people should leave Europe for Palestine, their historic homeland. So this is where the idea of settling the Jewish population, and there's pogroms going on in Russia right at this time in the late 1880s.
Yeah.
This idea comes from something that is very legitimate. You know what I mean? Like I'm not someone that like will look at like the plight of like Jewish people in Europe in the 1880s, and then obviously it gets even worse from that point, and say that there is not something to the idea of like we need to find a place that is safe for us.
Right. Well, I mean, like we're currently reading a book about World War One, right? The
Great Class War.
Great Class War by Jacques R. Pauls. Right, and it's interesting because we're reading about how like I think it was either the Kaiser or the other guy that came before Bismarck, right, when they were like a young man, is like giving these speeches out in like rural Prussia or Germany, whatever it was called at the time, and like
not only that, anti-Semitism is expected from Germany. Like but you got to think about the Dreyfus affair in France also. Yeah. Like what I mean? Like other Western European nations, enlightened nations, were still. It wasn't just Russia with pogroms. It wasn't just Germany with its institutional anti-Semitism. There was also deep anti-Semitism existing in places like France with the Dreyfus affair. A Dreyfus affair is when a number of French officers were essentially like convicted of like treasonous crimes, but really it was just suspicion that they were like Jewish kind of traitors exactly.
Right. Oh, and the whole Enlightenment thing, we're not saying that as like a broad.
I was saying it sarcastically.
Right. But like,
I don't think that needed to be explained.
The post-Enlightenment era, I don't think a lot of people are going to be.
Yeah, I was sarcastically saying that even in the enlightened nations such as France, there was rampant anti-Semitism. I don't know if that needed to be explained, but according to Johnny, it needed to be.
Hey, listener, I'm fellow dummy listener. I'm looking out for you.
So. Theodor Herzl, I don't have this in the notes, but actually when I was reading, the Dreyfus affair was actually extremely influential on him.
I did not know that.
Because that was part of the reason why, like, he was essentially saying Jewish people have no place in Europe.
Right.
Because this is what's happening.
That'll do it.
Right. And I'm sympathetic with just about everything on that, but then when you execute that plan in the way that it did, you have to understand that there's other innocent people that are now going to be suffering immensely because of that. And you can't necessarily, like, justify the one because of the other.
Right.
And that's where the issue comes. But I don't want to jump too far
Unless
ahead.
you use like a holy book from like 2000.
Well, then you can justify it, yeah. So let's talk about Theodor Herzl, right? Because, this guy was he was an idea guy. He wasn't actually in Palestine doing anything. But let's see kind of like where those ideas, those theoretical ideas of Herzl kind of came into practice as we understand what happened in Palestine. So here's a quote from Mr. Herzl here, where he says, "We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our own country. Expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly."
That sounds kind of ominous.
It sounds quite ominous, yeah. Especially when in hindsight, it's extremely. So he's saying you should take the poor people that live in Palestine, whisk them away, give them employment somewhere else, don't employ them, essentially, discriminate them in employment, and expropriate and remove all of them discreetly, secretly. the ideological foundation of Zionism does call for this type of expropriation and expulsion of the native population,
Right.
which would be the Palestinians.
Did he ever even like make it to Palestine?
No, he died.
Wow.
So, and Herzl was also not alone in this type of rhetoric. Leo Motzkin, who was a Ukrainian Zionist and he was a leader of the World Zionist Congress, said in 1917, "Our thought is that the colonization of Palestine has to go in two directions: Jewish settlement in Israel and the resettlement of the Arabs of Israel in areas outside the country. The transfer of so many Arabs may seem at first unacceptable economically, but is nonetheless practical. It does not require too much money to resettle a Palestinian village on another land."
I love how he, he had his eye on the
He's
prize.
crunching the numbers.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's like, I know what you're going to say. Where are we going to get the money to move all these Palestinian
How are we
people?
going to afford it?
And he's like, listen, this is an investment, guys.
Right.
That's what his concern is.
That
It's
is-
not like, the hundreds of thousands of people that are going to be displaced,
no
potentially
moral,
die.
question or ambiguity there.
So now we understand that there is the birth of this thing called Zionism in Europe. But let's see, how does this translate to what happens in Palestine? Because you can have all these ideas in this, kind of diaspora population of Jewish people throughout, well, not even Jewish people, specifically of the Zionist community in Europe. But what is the institutional power that realizes this idea of Zionism? And it's Britain.
Right.
So
Britain's always been good to,
It's Britain. So the first negotiations between the British and the Zionists took place at a conference on February 7th, 1917, that included Sir Mark Sykes and the Zionist leadership. Now, Sir Mark Sykes, put that name in your back pocket, because this guy, Sykes, will be coming up in just a few moments. So just know that there is high-level individuals in the British government meeting with Zionist leadership to discuss the development of a Jewish state, of the state of Israel.
Pocketed,
yeah. So now we're going to go back to a quote out of by Illan Pappi, who says, British Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour gave the Zionist movement his promise in 1917 to establish a national home for the Jews in Palestine. So this guy Balfour, he was British Foreign Secretary.
Right.
It's funny that they were still calling them lords in 1917, but yeah, Lord Balfour. So this is something called the Balfour Declaration.
Right.
This is a very important thing if you're going to learn about the history of Zionism and the development of Israel. So just to throw this out there, and you might think, man, this Balfour guy, what a benevolent individual that's like really looking out for the Jewish people.
He's declaring,
Yeah. Well, actually, earlier that year, Balfour had successfully driven the Aliens Act through Parliament with impassioned speeches regarding the need to restrict the wave of immigration into Britain from Jews fleeing the Russian Empire.
Oh.
So, actually, what might seem like a very, benevolent support for the Jewish community of Europe is more like, I don't want them here.
Yeah, with that little bit of context for, the Alien Act, right? The people of Earth, kind of illegal aliens.
That's what they're referring to.
Right.
Yeah,
well, I mean, because of, things going on currently with the U.S.
I guess there's more alien talk going
we
on.
need to specify which kind of aliens now.
So let's actually figure out what this Balfour Declaration is, and this is also quoted out of the notes of the Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Illan Pappi. The Balfour Declaration was a letter dated November 2nd, 1917, from British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Zionist community. The text of the Balfour Declaration, agreed at a cabinet meeting on October 31st, 1917, happy Halloween, set out the position of the British government. His Majesty's government, this is what it actually said, right? He said, this is it verbatim. His Majesty's government view with the favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country.
Well, it's right there in writing.
It's right there, yeah.
Like,
I mean, and it seems like they only really fixated on the part of that where it says that we will facilitate the endeavors to achieve this object, and kind of glossed over that whole, we cannot prejudice the civil and religious rights of non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
Yeah, no. Forget that second part. I mean, the object, that's the important thing, right?
Yeah. So now we're at a point where we have this thing called Zionism that is,
right.
I don't know if I would call it, I would say it's popular, but it's also somewhat fringe. This is certainly not the idea of every Jewish person in
right.
Europe, but it's gaining traction and it has influence in
right.
the British government. But how does that materialize a colony hundreds of miles away in Palestine?
I would say thousands at least.
Probably
right?
thousands of miles, yeah. And that happens, the answer to that lies in World War I.
Ah.
So World War I, as, you may or may not know, we're currently reading a very extensive book on World War I on stream. Maybe wait a month or two and we'll have a podcast out on that. But World War I, Britain and France were allied. Right. And one of the belligerents against them was the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
Now, this thing occurs in 1916 called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where essentially Britain and France can kind of see the writing on the wall that Ottoman Empire ain't going to make it through.
Say psych. Say psych right now.
Say Sykes-Picot right now.
Say Sykes.
And they start kind of, plotting on the land that will be available once the Ottoman Empire falls.
What do you mean, like everybody's just going to move out of there?
Well, so what the Sykes-Picot Agreement is a 1916 secret treaty between the United Kingdom and France with assent from the Russian Empire and the Kingdom of Italy, who was also, with them in the Triple Entente. It's the
right, you can always tell which one's the Entente.
Because it's in French, yes. So to define their mutually agreed spheres of influence and control in the eventual partition of the Ottoman Empire. So they're plotting right now. Like a lot of these countries that we know today, like Syria, like Israel, there's other ones. I think even Iraq didn't exist.
Iran, Saudi Arabia.
Didn't exist until after World War I.
Yeah.
A lot of these lines were drawn after that, and specifically places like Syria and Palestine were drawn by specifically colonial powers. So, to go further into the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the agreement is seen by many as a turning point in Western and Arab relations. It reneged upon the UK's promise to Arabs regarding a national Arab homeland in the area of Greater Syria in exchange for supporting the British against the Ottoman Empire. The agreement, along with others, was made public by these people called the Bolsheviks. I don't know. They
Bolsheviks?
Yeah. Apparently after the Imperial Russian Empire fell and who these Bolshevik guys got into, they kind of pulled the rug out about this whole process and kind of said to the world like, hey, we just, we're in the palace right now. We're looking over some documents. And just so you know, France and Britain have been plotting on this territory to essentially colonize it and extract the resources out of it.
See what old Nicky was up to. Let's look through some of these drawers here.
But that's not even the most important part. That's just kind of like a funny thing to mention. The most important part is that what we're seeing here is a very duplicitous intention by Britain, where they're playing both sides.
Sides?
Playing both sides so that they come out on top.
Right.
So on one end, they are they're communicating with the Zionist lobby, saying we got you a homeland, in the Middle East. But then also to the Arab population, they're saying we need you to join us against the Ottoman Empire. Right. We need you to rise up against the Ottoman Empire, and we'll give you you'll get a state.
Right.
It's like Oprah.
And everybody gets
you get a state. You get a state.
Yeah.
You get a state.
Yeah.
So
who's drawing the lines for these states again?
Yeah. So to continue on that, the correspondence comprised 10 letters exchanged from July 1915 to March 1916, in which the British government agreed to recognize Arab independence after the war in exchange for the Sharif of Mecca launching the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Right. So you have a population in what would become Palestine saying, all right, we're gonna work with the British, we're gonna revolt against the Ottoman Empire, and then we get independence.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah,
we're good.
Yeah,
but then also you have the Zionist lobby in Britain working with the British political structure saying, we're going to get a state out there, right? And they're like, yeah, we got you.
This all sounds like a win-win-win so far.
Yeah. So this leads us to something called the British Mandate period, British Mandatory Palestine,
right.
which was effectively, you could call it a colony, you could call it a sphere of influence type thing, but what it was is that effectively Britain had colonial administration over this land that is now called Palestine because the Ottoman Empire no longer exists.
Right.
Let's quote Illan Pappi to really figure out what the intentions were here. Okay. So until 1928, this started in, I believe, 1920, or maybe just right at the end of World War I. So they had this colonial administration over Palestine. Until 1928, the British government had treated Palestine as a state within the British sphere of influence, which, under British tutelage, the promise to the Jews and the aspirations of the Palestinians could both be fulfilled.
Right.
In practice, when the offer was made, it was less equitable.
Really?
It advantaged the Zionist colonies and discriminated against the Palestinian majority.
Huh.
The balance within the new proposed legislative council was in favor of the Jewish community, who were to be allied with members appointed by the British administration. So what you have here is, like, I guess on paper, it was like, okay, we're going to make everybody happy here. We're going to make, we're going to make the Zionists get their area, and then we're going to, respect Palestinian independence and autonomy. But the problem is that you already have people with a legislative council that are being appointed by the British administration that are kind of like working towards the Zionist end, and not so much in the independent Arab state.
I feel like that happens a lot when, these situations of, we'll make everybody happy.
Right.
Normally, somebody's getting, the short end of the stick,
right.
In situations like that.
Illan Pappi continues that as the Palestinians made up the majority of between 80 and 90% of the total population in the 1920s, they understandably refused at first to accept the British suggestion of parity, let alone one that disadvantaged them in practice. And the important word there is parity. So you have a population of Arab citizens, of what they would call themselves Palestinians, that are between 80 and 90% of the population. Right. And this word parity, they're saying, so like a tenth of the population is going to have as much as 90% of the population. And they're like, that doesn't seem fair.
No,
I'm not a math guy. I'm not a numbers guy, but that doesn't seem perfectly equitable.
Right.
So now this causes quite a bit of issues between the growing population of Jewish immigrants and the native population of Arabs. Right. You start having tension between them. And I think a lot of this period where this conflict happens is described in very ideological terms, like, Arabs hate Jews, Jews hate Arabs. It's like cats and dogs. They're going to fight.
But that's not the case, though, because, as we read this book, we learned that, there were Jewish people already present. There were Christian people already present,
Correct.
And they had no real issues. It seems like a pretty laid-back place.
Right. So what I was going to say is that there's actually much more to this than just the ideological component. And actually there's a large economic factor, or several economic factors, that really contributed to the friction between the Jewish immigrants and the Arab population. It's not so much like Jews are here, I hate Jews, let's kill Jews. Arabs are here, I hate Arabs, let's kill Arabs.
Right.
There was actually much more going on here, and I think this is important to talk about because this wasn't quite touched upon enough in the book, in my opinion, and I feel like we can really learn a lot about what happened here. So, World War I left Palestine deeply impoverished. Mandate authorities, meaning British authorities, levied high taxes on farming, and during the 1920s and 1930s, this contributed to increasing indebtedness of the peasantry. So you have, when you say the peasantry, we're going to learn now that that's like the Palestine's peasant farmers made up over 2/3 of the indigenous Arab population. So you have this population of peasants that were 2/3 of the population.
2/3 of the population is farming in what's been referred to as a desert?
Yeah. So, you have these high taxes and also just like general poverty from the war that is causing increased indebtedness, right? So the rents paid by the tenant peasantry, increased sharply, owing to increased population density and growing transfer of land from Arabs to the Jewish settlement agencies, which increased the number of the peasants evicted while also removing the land as a future source of livelihood. So while you're raising taxes, and people can't own the land anymore. They
Right.
want to sell the land.
Right.
Who's buying the land? More well-off immigrants from Europe that have more money than the landless peasants that are now kind of like living like a surf lifestyle in Palestine. So,
and not like the hang ten surf, like the
no, like serfdom, yes.
Yeah.
Like feudal serfs. And so they're selling, they're very, very much coerced, either, indirectly coerced because of these increased taxes to sell the land.
Right.
And the Jewish immigrants are buying the land.
Right.
The Shaw Commission in 1930 identified the existence of a class of embittered landless people as a contributing factor to the preceding 1929 disturbances. And the problem of these landless Arabs grew particularly grave after 1931, causing High Commissioner Wachope to warn that this social peril would serve as a focus of discontent and might even result in serious disorders.
Really?
So you have this huge population, the majority of the population by a significant margin, landless, poor, peasant. And then you have, obviously an immigrant population coming in that is being facilitated by this colonial administration that you never asked for. You were agreed independence.
Right.
And right now you're being colonially administered, and you're kind of watching your economic prospects just kind of being dissolved in front of you by this joint kind of like Zionist and British collaboration.
And this is all happening, fairly quickly?
It's happening within like a decade and a half, yeah.
Right. So, like, basically, I guess, kind of similar to what's happening here a little bit, in terms of, like, the last 10 years. Everything is more expensive. Nobody can afford rent,
But much more dire because these are people
Right.
that literally worked the land.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, it's different when you can, like, work on your
when
your
like
computer.
2/3
Yeah.
of, like, the population is
Exactly.
like a farmer.
So, again, Palestine's peasant farmers made up over 2/3 of the indigenous Arab population, and from the 1920s onward, they were pushed off the land in increasingly large numbers and into urban environments where they were often encountered only poverty and social marginalization. Many were crowded into shanty towns in Jaffa and Haifa.
Huh.
So this is all, none of that has to do with like, oh, there was religious wars in the street because people worshipped a different idea of an Abrahamic God.
Right.
This is very much economically driven. There's a very material basis for a lot of this
Right.
conflict at this
Right.
point.
So, this is actually, what's that age-old adage, follow the money, right? I feel like this is probably what's going to line up a lot more and make a lot more sense than, like, basically what we've been told, which a lot of times comes out to, like, to be bullshit anyways.
Right. So now, at the same time that all this economic stuff is going on,
Right.
Jewish immigration peaked in 1935. Over the 4 years between 1933 and 1936, more than 164,000 Jewish immigrants arrived in Palestine, and between 1931 and 1936, the Jewish population more than doubled, from 175,000 to 370,000, increasing the Jewish population share from 17% to 27%, and bringing about a significant deterioration in relations between Palestinian Arabs and Jews. So you have all this going on, and like, there is issues with this that are condemnable on the Arab side. Like, there is riots in 1929 where like angry Arabs are going in and they're murdering Jewish immigrants.
Is that the same year as the general strike that they
No,
had?
1929, no.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We're going to talk about the 1936 Arab Revolt in a moment.
Okay.
But in
My bad.
1929, you do have this like brimming ethnic tension, and there's certainly things that are condemnable that the Arab population would the way that they would act out on these like immiserations.
Well, I mean, like-
and it's like, obviously I think you can point a lot of this at the British in how they were like arranging this situation.
Right.
But, these things did happen.
I don't know if we have statistics in terms of, like, literacy rate for a lot of these people. I'm assuming that, like, a lot of these people are peasant farmers, right, to begin with, right? And that maybe, I know that much later on in the book, it goes on to say, like, how a lot of these people lived a fairly sedentary, like, they kind of stayed within, like, their areas. They didn't really, like, move around much, and they kind of just stayed where they grew up pretty much. And that, in terms of political literacy, right, there's not a whole lot of that going on. So, like,
I don't know. I'm probably not going to talk down. I'm probably,
I'm not trying to talk
in terms of
down.
political literacy, I think the Palestinian people probably could have arranged their own governmental structures if they were given the
Right, but I
opportunity
mean,
to.
we'll get into why that kind of wasn't able to even.
Right.
Yeah.
So that leads us to this thing, these tensions simmer and simmer and simmer and eventually boil over into this thing called the 1936 Arab Revolt. And one thing I want to say right before that, this Arab Revolt, like I said, it did not just come from a place of unfounded xenophobia, let's say. You know what I mean? Because another point that's important is that on October 16th, 1935, so a year before the revolt, a large shipment of camouflaged cement bins comprising 25... Oh, okay, I'm sorry. In 1935, a large arms shipment camouflaged in cement bins containing 25 Lewis guns and their bipods, 800 rifles, and 400,000 rounds of ammunition destined for the Haganah, which was a Jewish paramilitary group, was discovered during unloading at the port of Jaffa. The news sparked Arab fears of a Jewish military takeover of Palestine. So this is before any specific general strike was happening or revolt.
Right.
With this period of mounting tension, there's this discovery of this massive cache of weapons that are coming in being directed to this militia group, Zionist militia group. And Arab people are like, holy shit, war is at our doorstep. They're about to try to take over our country by force.
Right, so let's run down the list here. They are not being respected by the British that promised them independence.
Correct.
Right. They are not able. They're financially suffering or economically suffering. They are being told, actually, this group of people that you've never really interacted with before, they're going to have parity, with you in your own country.
An extreme minority of the population is going to have parity with you in your country, yeah.
Right, while you are being, economically immiserated, politically immiserated, and then, we happen to catch them trying to sneak hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition and weapons for
correct. This is
murder.
This is what sets the stage of this thing called the 1936 Arab Revolt. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So the 1936 to 1939 Arab Revolt in Palestine was a popular nationalist uprising by Palestinian Arabs in Mandatory Palestine against the British administration of the Palestine Mandate. I feel like it said Palestine 100 times in that sentence. So they demanded Arab independence and the end of the policy of open-ended Jewish immigration and land purchases with the stated goal of establishing a Jewish national home. And I feel like that was important that it wasn't just Jewish immigration flat out, but it's this type of systemic immigration that it affects settler colonialism because it has the stated goal of establishing, it says that specifically, the stated goal of establishing this new national home.
Right.
So there's a Zionist project of settler colonialism. This revolt was extremely bloody. The way, and it really, this was against the British administration more than it was against Jewish people as they came to settle in Palestine. The 1936 Arab Revolt was more so against the British colonial administration.
The same British colonial administration that had gifted the people of the Indian subcontinent with civilization.
Do you need me to go in and correct that? Do you need me to go and break down that joke?
No.
The British reacted extremely draconianly.
Right.
Against these Arab uprisings.
Right, as the English have always treated, non-white people with such respect and dignity.
So, in an analysis of British statistics, Walid Khalidi estimates that 19,792 casualties for the Arabs, with about 5,000 dead, about 4,000 killed by the British, and about 1,200 dead due to intracommunal terrorism, and 14,760 wounded. By one estimate, 10% of the adult male Palestinian Arab population between 20 and 60 years old was killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled. Estimates of the number of Palestinian Jews killed are up to several hundred. So you do see somewhat of a disparate outcome here in terms of the dead. The Palestinians are by several times more affected by this crackdown against the revolt. Right. And what we do need to say here is so important because spoiler, there is a coming war in 1947, 1948 for this state of Israel to be established. just a couple years, less than 10 years before, or I'm sorry, about 10 years before that happened, you have 10% of the adult male population, which would probably be useful in this kind of like military issue, being either killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled.
Right. And, that is going to contextualize a lot of things for, let's say, somebody who is a poor peasant farmer. Maybe his dad is murdered in that uprising, right? Or their uncle, right? Or like their older brother or something, right? Like, that's going to contextualize something for a lot of people that, like, maybe don't have, like, a degree in, like, international relations or something like that, or have something of like a regional newspaper to contextualize that for them.
But the really important thing that I want to talk about here is how this affected the British moving forward.
Right.
So when we had this Arab revolt, which was unsuccessful, it caused the British mandate to give crucial support to pre-state Zionist militias like the Haganah, whereas on the Palestinian Arab side, the revolt forced the flight into exile of the main Palestinian Arab leadership of the period. So because the British are engaged in this like aggressive fight against the Palestinian Arabs, once that has been quelled, the British are arming and employing these kind of like Zionist militia groups like the Haganah. We're going to get more detailed into the Haganah in just a moment. So just know that this is like a Zionist militia group that existed in Palestine. They're arming them, they're supporting them, and they're employing them. So you have one side of this conflict that's being armed, supported, and employed by the British, a massive first world military empire in the world at this time.
One that has like made it their bread and butter.
Yes. And then the Palestinian side, which is being repressed, murdered, exiled, imprisoned, disarmed, and just all around marginalized
economically
in their homeland.
Suppressed.
Exactly.
Lack of any kind of political,
This is super important to learn about as we get into the 1948 war, that this is kind of like what's laying the foundation of these two sides. So to get further into that, we're going to quote the book directly by Illan Pappi, who says that the Arab Revolt duly erupted in 1936 in the form of a popular rebellion fought with such determination that it forced the British government to station more troops in Palestine than there were in the Indian subcontinent.
What?
If you know about the Indian subcontinent, it is fucking huge.
It's gigantic, and this is even before the partition of, like, India, Pakistan, Kashmir, Nepal,
Bangladesh. So you have this massive, subcontinent. It's just interesting so you know how extreme this conflict was. So Illan Pappi goes on to say, after 3 years with brutal and ruthless attacks on the Palestinian countryside, the British military subdued the revolt. The Palestinian leadership was exiled, and the paramilitary units that had sustained the guerrilla warfare against the military forces were disbanded. During this process, many of the villagers involved were arrested, wounded, or killed. The absence of most of the Palestinian leadership and of viable Palestinian fighting units gave the Jewish forces in 1947 an easy ride into the Palestinian countryside. So like I said, we are seeing, like, when you think about this war erupting in 1948, you can't just think of it as two sides on equal footing.
Right.
You have to think of this like immiserated and at best guerrilla,
from the start.
From the start, guerrilla operation that has just had this mechanized, systemic military machine of the British just effectively just kneecapping it in every way that it possibly can.
Right.
And then you have them supporting and lifting the Zionist paramilitary groups.
So the Haganah, I remember at one point in the book, like Pappi describes how they were trained by the British even prior to any of this, just in case, the Nazis.
So that's the Palmach, and we'll get into that. We'll get into that when we get to that section.
Group.
Yeah.
Okay.
So to get further into the kind of this treatment of the Palestinians under the British mandate, so military law allowed swift prison sentences to be passed. Thousands of Arabs were held in administrative detention without trial and without proper sanitation in overcrowded prison camps. So this is what's going on to those that revolted in Palestine during the 1936 revolt. In addition to actions against property, a large amount of brutality by the British occurred, including beatings, torture, and extrajudicial killings. Several incidents involved serious atrocities, such as massacres at Al-Bassa and Halul. The Haganah actively supported British efforts to suppress the uprising. Although the British administration did not officially recognize the Haganah, The British security forces cooperated with it by forming Jewish settlement police, Jewish supernumerary police, and special night squads. The special night squads engaged in activities described by colonial administrator Sir Hugh Foote, that's a funny name, as extreme and cruel, involving torture, whipping, and abuse and execution of Arabs. So you have the colonial administrator of the British saying that these special night squads, which were like effectively like you had the official colonial administration.
Right.
And then you had the Haganah, which is a Jewish, Zionist paramilitary militia. But then they start employing these people into these things called night squads and settlement police and things like that. And you have the British colonial administrator saying that they were extreme and cruel and carried out torture, whipping, abuse, and execution of Arabs under the employment of the British.
And if you have like a colonial, what was the title? Colonial administrator saying that was cruel.
Right.
Like, good Lord, like how bad was it? Because like it's gonna be more than anything you could imagine or anything that like you could ever see on like a documentary.
Right. So let's get a little bit deeper into this. So the British authorities maintained, financed, and armed the Jewish police from this point onward until the end of the mandate. And by the end of September 1939, around 20,000 policemen, supernumeraries, and settlement guards had been authorized to carry arms by the government. So 20,000 of these militia groups were all licensed to carry arms,
Good God.
which also distributed weapons to Jewish settlements and allowed the Haganah to acquire arms. That's this, you might think like, oh, okay, they're licensed to acquire arms. Why is that so important? It's extremely important because in June 1937, the British imposed the death penalty for unauthorized possession of weapons, ammunition, and explosives. But since many Jewish people had permission to carry weapons and store ammunition for defense, this order was directed primarily against Palestinian Arabs, and most of the 112 executed in Acre prison were hanged for illegal possession of arms.
Good God.
That's one city, by the way. The Acre prison, that's one city in Palestine that we're drawing an example on. That 112 people were executed for illegal possession.
So that's only one example out of the entire country.
The entire country, correct.
Oh my God. All right. So they're politically, suppressed. They are economically suppressed. They have no independence to speak of, right? They have no military, right? No paramilitary. They have no, they can't even independently have firearms, or else they'll be sent to prison to will
be hung.
Execute.
Like they're not even just being. They're not even.
And that
from
they're
everything that we're
making
reading
that shit,
here, this is
too.
for everything that we're reading here. These are overcrowded, unsanitary prisons without trial and summary executions, extrajudicial executions.
Right.
So
you're not getting shot in the street. You're getting hung probably publicly.
Yeah. So, and then it's also important to note that from October 1937, the Irgun, which is another Zionist militia group, instituted a wave of bombings against Arab crowds and buses. For the first time in the conflict, massive bombs were placed in crowded Arab public places, killing and maiming dozens. These attacks substantially increased Arab casualties and sowed terror among the population. And I point that out because it's like we have a very, very incorrect, erroneous stereotype of Arab people,
right.
Suicide bombings, terrorist attacks, and things like that.
Very 9/11 tinted.
And and it's not to say that there's no Arabs. Arab militia forces that do engage in that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's also important to know that the Zionists and the Israelis have a long history of their time in Palestine of bombing crowds, bombing buses, engaging in terrorism. We're going to get into a number of terroristic activities that they get into. But, this is not something... When we go through this list, I'm going to ask at the end, so, hey, if you heard about these people that bombed this bus, bombed this coffee shop, assassinated this political figure, assassinated this... You're going to say, like... I think the average person, if you ask them, like, which side of the conflict did this? They'd be like, oh, that's Arab. The Arabs definitely did all that.
Yeah.
And it's like...
The Ben Shapiro answer of...
Exactly, yeah. Arabs love to bomb shit or whatever the fuck he said. So, let's pause right here. Now, I've referenced a couple times here this thing called the Haganah and this thing called the Irgun. And, I've tried to be like, this is a Zionist paramilitary organization. But let's talk about more about these things specifically and just understand, because they really came during the 1936 Arab Revolt, or like a little bit prior. So let's kind of talk about these Zionist paramilitary organizations. Right. So we're going to start with the Haganah. This was the main Zionist paramilitary organization in Mandatory Palestine between 1920 and its disestablishment in 1948, when it became the core of the Israeli Defense Forces, known as the IDF.
Right.
So that's also what's really important here, is that these weren't just like these these cells that existed in Palestine. This is what quite literally made up the IDF, what would be the formal Israeli army.
Right. The one that still exists today.
Yes.
Yeah.
So during World War I, the forerunners of the Haganah and the IDF were the Zion Mule Corps and the Jewish Legion, both of which were part of the British Army. So this is important to know. These weren't just like ragtag soldiers, guerrilla warriors from the countryside or anything like that. These were individuals who were formally trained in warfare by the British Empire.
Right.
So that's important to know that as well. In 1931, the more militant elements of the Haganah splintered off and formed the Irgun. So better known, the Irgun. So that's how you understand that there's the Haganah and then there's the Irgun. The Irgun was a more extreme cell of the Haganah that felt that the Haganah were being too defensive and they needed a more offensive force against the Palestinian population.
It's already a paramilitary group. How
right.
how
So just to get a little, so during the 36 to 39 Arab revolt in Palestine, the Haganah worked to protect British interests and to quell Arab rebellion. The battle experience gained during the training was useful in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. So it says right there in no uncertain terms that this battle experience from the 1936-1939 Arab revolt was extremely useful in that coming war. Like I said, you have one side that is being attacked by the British and another side that is being trained by the British.
And armed.
And kind of like what you were alluding to earlier, there's also this group called the Palmach. And so in 1941, the Haganah created the Palmach, which is an elite commando section in preparation against the possibility of a British withdrawal and an Axis invasion of Palestine. Its members, young men and women, received specialist training in guerrilla tactics and sabotage. In 1942, the British gave assistance in the training of the Palmach volunteers. By 1939, the British had issued the White Paper, which severely restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine, deeply angering the Zionist leadership. So, up until this time in 1931, the British are like the darlings of the Zionists. They're working together and everything's working well. In 1939, there is chaos in what is called Mandatory Palestine.
All hell broke loose.
It is not going great. So they flip a little bit here. And the British say, we have to do this thing called the White Paper, and we need to restrict Jewish immigration here because things here are not stable. Things are not good. People are dying. People are getting bombed.
Right.
Like this is not. We have to.
This is 1939.
Yeah, we have to calm this down. But that in turn infuriated the Zionist forces because they're like, well, now you're turning against us.
Right.
So
I mean, especially because I feel like there's something else happening in 1939 somewhere else in the world.
Yeah. So this led to a pretty much another. So it was the Arab revolt against the British. Now you're having what is essentially like a Zionist revolt against the British. So just a year later in 1940, the Haganah sabotaged the Patria, which was an ocean liner being used by the British to deport 1,800 Jewish people to Mauritius.
Oh.
With a bomb that was intended to cripple the ship. However, the ship sank, killing 267 people and injuring 172.
Oh, good
so
God.
The British were sending out a ship of 1,800 Jewish people, deporting them to Mauritania.
Right.
Or, I'm sorry, Mauritius. The Haganah bombed the ship, trying to cripple it, and ended up sinking it and killing hundreds of people.
Oh, well,
when you talk about this terrorist shit, like this is real deal, like innocent people bombing ships. And also, I imagine most of those people were Jewish. If 1,800 people were being deported on that. So that was probably a little bit of the backfire, but still.
In 1939.
Yeah. Yeah.
During
the Holocaust.
Yeah, pretty much.
Operational concentration camps while this is happening.
Right. And it's just like, and you're deporting them where again? Like.
Yeah. So this type of shit continues. So in 1944, they assassinated Lord Moyne, which is the British Minister of State for the Middle East. So these Zionist terrorist groups are murdering, assassinating British ministers at this point. Also, they're bombing ships, bombing cafes, bombing buses.
This is all in the middle of World War II.
Yes. So the Haganah worked with the... So now you see in a different twist of fate, the Haganah, who are more moderate.
Right.
Then you have the Irgun and the Lehi, with the Lech, which I'll call the Stern Gang because it's just easier for me to say. I don't speak Hebrew that
Lehi?
well. Yeah, I don't speak Hebrew that well. So the Irgun and the Stern Gang are like, fuck the British. And the Haganah, who are trained by the British, are more like, we're going to ride with the British. So now you have the Haganah working with the British to kidnap, interrogate, and in some cases deport Irgun members.
Good God.
So now you have a Jewish on Jewish situation here where Jewish Haganah people are kidnapping and torturing and deporting other Jewish paramilitary forces.
What happened to the win-win-win situation?
Oh, yeah.
Where
That's
everybody was supposed to be happy.
That's long gone. So to talk about the Irgun, we can read from a letter to the New York Times written by one Albert Einstein. I don't know if you're familiar with this person. But
wait, like the guy with the funny picture where he's sticking his tongue out?
The famous tongue model.
Okay.
Albert Einstein.
Okay.
Wrote to the New York Times in 1948. He compared the Irgun and its successor party to Nazi and fascist parties and described it as a terrorist, right-wing, chauvinist organization.
You know, there's a lot of quotes by this guy, like, you know, E equals, like, you know, AB, up, down, or whatever, you know, but, like, you never hear that one.
No, you don't hear that one too often.
No.
So, now... during this time period, like this time period of the 40s, the Irgun mounted about 40 operations against Arabs and Arab villages. For instance, after a Jewish father and son were killed in the old city of Jerusalem on June 6 in 1938, Irgun members threw explosives from a roof of a nearby house, killing 2 Arabs and injuring 4. The Irgun planted landmines in a number of Arab markets, primarily in places identified by the Irgun as activity centers of armed Arab gangs. Explosives detonated in Arab souk in Jerusalem on July 15th killed 10 local Arabs, and in similar circumstances, 70 Arabs were killed by a landmine planted in the Arab souk in Haifa. So these are the kind of like terroristic activities that are being carried out by the Irgun. This is actually where things get really intense.
It's more intense?
The Stern Gang, which you have the Haganah, the Irgun, and then this thing called the Stern Gang, split from the Irgun militant group in the 1940s in order to continue fighting the British during World War II. It initially sought an alliance with fascist Italy and Nazi Germany.
Come on.
Believing that Nazi Germany was a lesser enemy of the Jews than Britain. The Stern Gang twice attempted to form an alliance with the Nazis, proposing a Jewish state based on nationalist and totalitarian principles and linked to the German Reich by an alliance.
Dude, were they, like, not aware of what was going on, like, you know, in Germany and a lot of Europe at that time?
I'm not sure what they knew.
Were they?
So let's talk a little bit more here. So according to Yaakov Shavit, the professor of the Department of Jewish History in Tel Aviv University, articles in the Stern Gang publications contained references to a Jewish master race contrasting the Jewish people with Arabs who were seen as a nation of slaves. Sasha Polakau-Serensky writes that the Lehi were also unabashedly racist towards Arabs. Their publications described Jews as a master race and Arabs as a slave race. Stern Gang advocated mass expulsion of all Arabs from Palestine and Transjordan, or even their physical annihilation.
Huh. That, I feel like, you know how there's, we talked about this fairly early on, like anti-Semitism, but you know how there's like a lot of people that will like point to something like, you know, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, something that literally was just made up by wealthy Russians.
Yeah, white Russians, yeah.
Yeah.
And then popularized by Henry Ford.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think that, like, publications like that is something that, like, they point to, right? You know, or at least, like, at one point did, and we're like, see?
I have no clue. I've never heard about it. This is really the
right,
first
yeah,
time.
This is brand new.
This is like the first time really hearing about a lot of this. So this kind of stuff continued, and there's another point of, like, terrorism from these groups that I'd like to point out, and this is the bombing of the King David Hotel. So the King David Hotel was in Jerusalem, and I guess it was the British administrative headquarters for Mandatory Palestine. So on July 1946, the militant right-wing Zionist underground organization, the Irgun, bombed it in a terrorist attack. 91 people of various nationalities were killed, including Arabs, Britons, and Jews, and 46 were injured. I believe the majority of the people that died in that were Jewish people. So these are the kind of things that these groups are taking out. These are not like valiant, freedom fighters.
Right.
In many circumstances, these are very much like settler colonial terrorists that are just like killing innocent people wholesale.
Right. Like this kind of checks off a lot of boxes for what I think most people would look at and be like, oh, that's an act of terrorism. That's egregious.
Yeah. So with this like kind of just powder keg of a situation, British stepped in. They're like, we're going to get a colony. This is going to be nice. Right. It's actually right on the way to India.
It's a good port city.
It's a good port city. We're, there's oil around. We're going to be living. Now there's just like blood flying everywhere and explosions.
Bombing.
And by 1947, Britain's like, why don't we just bow out of the situation? Why don't we just get the fuck out of here? Because this is way more intense than any of us anticipated.
It's just like, how is this causing more problems than the Indian subcontinent?
Oh, yeah.
How is this?
So, with that being said, on the 14th of February 1947, the British announced that the Jews and the Arabs would not be able to agree on any British proposed solution for the land, and therefore the issue must be brought to the United Nations for a final decision. So, the British are pretty much saying, we can't do it. We just can't make it. We can't fix this. We've created a real problem here.
Real snafu.
Yeah. We're going to leave. It's a real bloodbath out there. The UN you're going to handle this now.
We fucked this and we don't know how to unfuck it.
Right.
So
also, if you want to know a little bit more about what motivated the British to leave, some of the Irgun soldiers were captured by the British and they were being put to death. Because I don't know why, it sounds like the British are killing a ton of people down there. They're hanging people just for having guns. Now the Irgun is on their shit list.
Right.
They're going to kill some of the Irgun. So the Irgun responded by kidnapping 2 British officers. They took these officers. The death sentence was carried out against the Irgun prisoners. So the Irgun, the captured British officers were hung, and their corpses were fashioned with booby trapped with explosives, and they were left hanging from trees with booby-trapped explosives for British forces to come and retrieve. This actually caused an outcry in Britain and was condemned both there and by Jewish leaders in Palestine. This episode has been given as a major influence on the British decision to terminate the mandate and leave Palestine.
Like, that was just like, this is the final straw.
Yeah, that's kind of what
that'll be enough of that.
That's what they're saying, is that once, they had to put these dudes to death for whatever they were doing, and then as a response to that, they had officers that were hung and then had booby traps of explosives that they had to go and find, and so at that point, they're like, we're just getting the fuck out of here. This is whatever this was worth to us is no longer a thing. Right. And actually, we'll talk about why it's no longer worth, right? Because the British decision in February 1947 to quit Palestine and to transfer the Palestine question to the UN coincided with a Labour Party victory in Britain, who made its mind to leave India. Oh. So with no longer having India, Palestine is much less valuable. Right. Palestine was a nice stop on the way to India.
Right.
That could be, it's like kind of like on the other end of the Suez Canal.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Okay. So it's like you can use that. It's important for their commerce between the Indian subcontinent and the main island. Okay. So at the same time that this is happening, you have the Labour government, which is more liberal, probably more of an idea of independence for India.
So this is the liberal Labour Party's fault.
That they left? Yeah. It's kind of like how Joe Biden left Afghanistan and everything. They pulled the Band-Aid off. Of a lot of this.
Even though, the agreement had been made from the prior administration, and, it had literally been, worked out for, a couple of years beforehand.
Right. So now we have this situation where the UN has to figure out what to do now. There's a full-scale war essentially going on in Palestine at this point, and the UN has to figure out how to fix this.
How old is the UN at this point?
I'm not sure. But let's see the things that complicate this process of the UN, right?
Okay.
So when the Zionist movement started its ethnic cleansing operations in Palestine in early December 1947, the country had a mixed population of Palestinians and Jews. The indigenous Palestinians made up 2/3 of the majority, down from 90% at the start of the mandate. 1/3 were Zionist settlers. So this is where we're at in 1947. British are out. What are we going to do? 2/3 of the population are these Palestinians. 1/3 is Zionist settlers.
Right.
Almost all the cultivated land in Palestine was held by the indigenous population. Only
Right.
5.8% was in Jewish ownership in 1947, which makes the use of the adjective mixed somewhat misleading.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? It was only so mixed. So, Jewish newcomers overwhelmingly preferred the cities and towns. As a result, most of the Zionist settler colonies in the rural areas lay far apart from each other. So this is really important. You have this country, and you have all these cities, and you have in those cities mixed populations, like 50-50 Arab,
Right.
Jewish, because you have a lot of immigrants going there.
Right.
Then you have just speckled settlements, Jewish settlements around. So how do you slice that? It's not like half the country had a bunch of Jewish people in it and half the country had Arabs. You'd be like, this goes to you, this goes to you.
What if you just like snake the divide like through the
All right. Yeah. So,
It's like a number of S curves through it.
by the way, these are all quotes from the book right now that I'm reading. These are all
Right.
the quotes from Illan Pappi right here.
Right. Which, watchers, listeners, like if you watch our stream, right, a lot of times like what we are saying is literally taken directly from the book.
Correct. So, Illan Pappi says that the fact that so few Jews had settled in the Palestinian countryside provided to be a serious problem for those who wanted to base their solution to the growing conflict between the two communities on the principle of partition. So this is what the UN is going to do. They're going to try to partition. We got to partition this. But the fact that there's no clean way to partition this is going to be a real problem.
Right.
On the one hand, logic and common sense dictated that the countryside as a whole, more than 3/4 of the territory, should remain Palestinian. The towns, on the other hand, were almost equally inhabited. The question was how to devise two distinct Palestinian and Jewish entities with homogenous populations when this was the reality on the ground. So how can you rectify this? How can you make two states out of this extremely incestuous population centers in the urban areas and the sporadic settlements throughout the countryside?
Well, like the Sykes-Picot, deal showed, I feel like, Europe is really good at partitioning off land and respecting, different, cultural and ethnic and religious communities.
Yeah, because in India that worked out
Africa,
very well. Yeah, they're really good at
Asia.
drawing those lines and respecting those kind of differences.
Yeah, no, they're really good at that. They're like professionals at it.
So the UN recommended to the UN General Assembly to partition Palestine in two states, bound together in federation-like by economic unity. The report that the United Nations came up with in the end envisions that the two future states would be identical except for their internal demographic balance. On November 29th, 1947, this became General Assembly Resolution 181.2. So this is what the United Nations think is going to happen. We're going to have some kind of two identical future states that are going to be economically connected to one another.
Somehow, some way.
Yes. So it is clear that by accepting the partition resolution, the UN totally ignored the ethnic composition of the country's population. Had the UN decided to make the territory the Jews had settled in on Palestine correspond with the size of their future state, they would have entitled them to no more than 10% of the land. As a result, the Zionist movement was given a state that stretched over more than half of the country. So
That sounds...
the partition plan, when you have this population that makes up 1/10 to 1/3 of the population, receives over half of the country.
Huh.
And the 2/3 majority indigenous population receives less than half.
That would make, I think, anybody extremely frustrated.
Right. So it did make some people frustrated. And the Arab League and Regional Inter-Arab Organization and the Arab Higher Committee decided to boycott the negotiations with the United Nations. Partitioning the country, overwhelmingly Palestinian, into two equal parts has proven so disastrous because it was carried out against the will of the indigenous majority population. The chaos that followed produced the first Arab-Israeli war. the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians had started.
Oh, damn.
That's what it says in the book. Like, so, we set a lot of groundwork. We talked about the early Zionism. We talked about the World War I, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the British Mandate period, and really all the countervailing economic, ethnic, colonial issues that all came together to really create this really disastrous and bloody situation, really at the fault of the British. Majority in the fault of the British for trying to play both sides and think,
win, as it were. Yes.
So this created this chaotic situation where this Arab-Israeli war began.
Right. So, like, I think that a lot of people a lot of times get really hung up on, like, things that have happened after the events described here. And I think that, like, without this context, not a lot is really going to make sense in terms of, like, well, how come, like, the Palestinian government didn't intervene or anything?
There was no government.
Right. How come the Palestinian military, didn't protect their people?
There was no military.
How come, the Palestinian people didn't just take matters?
They had no money.
How come how come
the British pretty much ruined the chances of any of that happening because the Britain were more partial to the Zionists and the settlers coming because they were working with them in military capacities. You know what I mean? Like,
are you trying to say that the British were racist?
Yes. All right. So now let's talk a little bit more about the UN partition plan. And this is just some stuff that I pulled off Wikipedia to kind of fill us in maybe on some of the gaps. So,
and a lot of people, I think, are going to use Wikipedia.
Yeah, why not? Why not? We're just using Wikipedia to kind of corroborate. Because, you could read the book, and like I said, this is a controversial story, and you might have issues with the conclusions that he's drawing.
Right.
Well, I mean, you take it up with Wikipedia, because Wikipedia says a lot of the same things. So, the United Nations partition plan for Palestine sought to address the conflicting objectives and claims of two competing movements, Palestinian nationalism and Jewish nationalism, or Zionism, as it's called.
Right.
The proposed plan is considered to have been pro-Zionist by its detractors, with 62% of the land allocated to the Jewish state, despite the Palestinian Arab population numbering twice the Jewish population. So, I mean, like, this is a Wikipedia article that could have pretty much been taken out of the book. It's saying the exact same fucking thing.
Right. I mean, like, there was nothing that Illan Pappi was saying that is
not mainstream,
controversial about, like, the population disparity.
So, the Palestinian Arab leadership rejected the partition as unacceptable given the inequality in the proposed population exchange and the transfer of 1/3 of Palestine, including most of its best agricultural land, to recent immigrants. That's another portion here, is that there is an unfair distribution of land going on here.
Right.
You have this, like I said, 2/3 of the population are peasant farmers.
Right.
So you got to think that land is very important here into the functioning of this population.
Right.
So, we're going to introduce a guy named David Ben-Gurion here, who goes on to be like the first prime minister of Israel.
He's the George Washington
of Israel. That's a great way to put it. Yeah, thank you. So, regarding the partition, in a letter to his son in October 1937, Ben-Gurion explained that the partition would be a first step to possession of the land as a whole. Possession of the land as a whole. The same sentiment, the acceptance of partition, was a temporary measure beyond which the Palestine would be redeemed in its entirety. Not just a portion of it, as a whole in its entirety. Was recorded by Ben-Gurion on other occasions, such as a meeting of the Jewish Agency Executive in June 1938. So, you're going to hear some things that, like, oh, they could have just accepted it and we would have just stayed right in that area and we wouldn't have taken any more of Palestine. This is the Zionist perspective. That was never the case. This was always a means to an end. Like, 62%.
Right. And he's saying that in 1938.
Yeah.
So that's like,
yeah.
Before, like, the real, like, clusterfuck that was going on.
Here's something that I never thought of before I read this book. And I don't think it's what a lot of people think of when they think about the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Okay.
According to the plan, Jews and Arabs living in the Jewish state would become citizens of the Jewish state, and Jews and Arabs living in the Arab state would become citizens of the Arab state. Right. So you think about this. you partition Palestine. This is this is Israel. This is Palestine. There's a mixed population. We've already discovered how there's this really mixed population.
Right.
The UN didn't draw up this partition saying that you can ethnically cleanse the people that aren't of that ethnic persuasion. They said you have to subsume them into your states. These are your people now.
Well, I think that they probably thought well, Lebanon did it, all these other countries that
did Lebanon do
we partitioned. They have Christians and Jewish people and all of these other Yazidis and Druze and whatnot. They're all citizens of the same thing. It shouldn't be a problem, right?
Yeah. So it goes further to say, in Chapter 3 of the Partition Plan, Palestinian citizens residing in Palestine, as well as Arabs and Jews who not holding Palestinian citizenship resided in Palestine, upon the recognition of independence, become citizens of the state in which they were resident and enjoy full civil and political rights.
Huh.
So if you lived within those boundaries, you would get full civil and political rights.
Right. So that means that even if you were a Jewish immigrant that was living under the Arab state, you would have all of the same rights as any Arab citizen.
Yeah. Well, and there's also probably a heavy Zionist stereotype that all these Arab villages were warmongering anti-Semites, and that's just not the case. We're going to get into some of these things Palestinian villages that enjoyed warm and cordial relationships with Jewish settlements.
Right.
Such as the case of Deir Yassin, who the people were massacred. We will get into that.
Right.
So the land allocated to the Arab state in the final plan included about 43% of mandatory Palestine. The Jewish state was to receive 56% of mandatory Palestine. The Jewish state included 3 fertile lowland plains: the Sharon on the east, on the coast, the Jezreel Valley, and the Upper Jordan Valley. The Jewish state would also be given sole access to the Sea of Galilee, crucial for its water supply, and the economically important Red Sea. Now, I have way too much information on this, but if you look up about this partition plan, there was so much information about Zionists, so this says about the pressure that Zionist lobbies put on various countries. So Zionists launched an intense White House lobby to have United Nations plan endorsed, this partition plan that we were just reading about.
Right.
And the effects were not trivial. Democratic Party, a large part of whose contributions came from Jewish people, informed Truman that failure to live up to the promises to support the Zionist effort in Palestine would constitute a danger to the party. This is apparently a very legitimate pressuring from the Zionist lobby to Truman's White House to accept this. You can go down and there is, let's see here. In the United States, President Truman later noted the facts were that not only there were pressure movements around the United Nations. Why is this so terrible? There we go. The facts were that not only were there pressure movements around the United Nations, unlike anything that had been seen there before, but that the White House, too, was subjected to constant barrage. I do not think that I have ever had as much pressure and propaganda aimed at the White House as I had in this instance. The persistence of a few of the extreme Zionist leaders, actuated by political motives and engaging in political threats, disturbed and annoyed me. That is from the memoirs of President Truman. Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, I said his name so bad, Jawaharlal Nehru, spoke with anger and contempt the way that the UN vote had been lined up. He said that the Zionists had tried to bribe India with millions, and at the same time, his sister, the Indian ambassador to the UN, had received daily warnings that her life was in danger unless she voted correctly. They did not, actually. They voted against, actually. The Indian ambassador actually walked out of there.
Wow.
Yeah. So in Liberia, you've read about Liberia with Firestone there, right?
I have not.
Firestone tires and the rubber that they get from Liberia.
I think I have read something about
Liberia's ambassador to the United States complained that the U.S. delegation threatened aid cuts to several countries. Harvey S. Firestone Jr., president of Firestone Natural Rubber Company with major holdings in the country, also pressured the Liberian government.
Wait, an American businessman has sway in another country over how they vote?
You can go through all this: Philippines, Haiti, France, Venezuela, Cuba. I'm not going to read each one of these for the sake of time, but there's just, not only from the United States,
Right.
with aid being withheld and business ventures and Zionist lobbying groups pressured quite a few. There's also instances of they're far less successful of Arab groups like saying like you better vote against this. I'm not saying that
Right.
it wasn't on both sides,
Right.
but one was like far more successful than the
Right.
other.
One had a little bit more
Zest on it, you know what I mean?
little bit more riz.
Yeah. So, and then this is the other part. Remember how I was saying that, oh, we'll just take our 62% and that'll be fine?
Right.
There's many historians, including Illan Pappi, that say that this was just a means of getting land officially and that they
Right.
never had any plans to stop expanding, and they wanted, as Ben-Gurion said, the whole of Palestine. So let's read a little bit more about that. So some post-Zionist scholars endorsed Sima Flappin's view that it is a myth that Zionists accepted the partition as a compromise by which the Jewish community abandoned ambitions for the whole of Palestine and recognized by the rights of the Arab Palestinians to their own state. So they're saying this is a myth, that they compromised and that they said, we will abandon the ambitions for the whole of Palestine and recognize the right of Arab Palestinians.
Well, we'll stop trying to take
So,
the whole thing.
Sima Flappin, which is a post-Zionist scholar, it says that this is a myth. Rather, Flappin argued acceptance was only a tactical move that aimed to thwart the creation of an Arab-Palestinian state and, concomitantly, expand the territory that had been assigned by the UN to the Jewish state. Barak Kimmerling has said that Zionists officially accepted the partition plan, but invested all their efforts toward improving its terms and maximally expanding their boundaries while reducing the number of Arabs in them. So yeah, this is definitely several historians are saying that they were going to take more.
This isn't just some crackpot theory, by this
By Illan
controversial,
Pappi. Exactly.
This controversial, self-hating, Israeli Jewish historian. This is like several historians that have researched this subject being like, no, that's a myth.
Exactly. So let's quote our friend Ben-Gurion again. So he was addressing the Central Committee of the Israel Workers' Party days after the UN vote to partition Palestine. Ben-Gurion expressed his apprehension, stating, and this is where it really gets real ethno-nationalist, right? And it shows that Ben-Gurion was never satisfied with this amount of land.
Right.
He says, and he was never satisfied with the amount of Arabs that were living in what they were given.
What, like he wanted more?
So the total population, this is his words that I'm quoting, the total population of the Jewish state at the time of its establishment will be about 1 million, including almost 40% non-Jews. Such a population composition does not provide a stable basis for a Jewish state. This demographic fact must be viewed in all its clarity and acuteness. With such a population composition, there cannot even be absolute certainty that control will remain in the hands of the Jewish majority. There can be no stable and strong Jewish state so long as it has Jewish majority of only 60%. So he's saying there, just in no ambiguous terms, that we need a larger Jewish majority in this state. 60% won't do. 40% Arab won't do. We need to flip. Yeah, well, not flip, but we need to get rid of some of that 40%.
Oh.
Is kind of yeah. So now we're going to go back to quoting Illan Pappi. According to the partition plan, the UN was to be present on the ground to supervise the implementation of its peace plan, the making of Palestine as a whole into an independent country. With two distinct states that were to form one economic unity, the resolution of November 29, 1947 included very clear imperatives. Among them, the UN pledged to prevent any attempt by either side to confiscate land that belonged to citizens of the other state, or the other national group, be it cultivated or uncultivated land that had been laying fallow for about a year. So, the UN pledged to prevent either side from confiscating land that belonged to citizens of the other state.
Wait, so you're going to tell me that the UN was going to stop Palestinian people from, I guess, like, using land that they had probably been living on for, like, what? 2,000 years at that point.
What I'm saying is that the UN pledged to not allow someone to take land from the other state.
Oh, okay.
And they did not live up to that pledge, is the point that I'm making.
Okay.
So, Johnny, let me ask you something.
Okay.
Do you think at this point we should break this off and split this into 2 parts?
How long are we at now?
We're at 118, and that's not including the intro before we started doing this.
Breaking this off into 2 parts might be smart.
Okay. We're going to continue talking now, though, and just...
Yeah.
Okay. So, guys, thanks for being here. Hopefully this was informative and somewhat entertaining. We don't want to make the individual episode too long. We're trying to cap it at about an hour and a half. We're in a learning process right now. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't realize how long this was going to be. Unfortunately, we're not even into really the War of 1948, but, this does require significant groundwork being laid to really understand it. You can't just jump into 1948 when the war's raging and be like, oh, let's try to figure this thing out. Yeah. We have to go back and we have to talk about it.
We're jumping into an entirely new medium, an entirely new setup, that is, going to take a little bit of fine tunings and, taking a hammer to, technology. Yeah. We're 2 tech geniuses, so we'll figure it out, and the quality will improve. Yeah.
So if you're interested in continuing hearing this story, not only just the story but also the book summary and the book review of Illan Pappi's Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, please check out part 2, where we're gonna go through the actual war and its aftermath. So thanks for being here.
See you next time.